on-demand replay for TMA 2024 is generously sponsored by EAS Consulting Group and Labstat, members of the certified group of companies.
Appreciate the introduction and apologies I couldn't be there in person with you all. I'm hoping to get back next year. I'll say this is a busy week for conferences. I had over a half dozen requests for this week alone, so I'm juggling as many as I can. I'm overseas coming to today from a government rate hotel in suburban Amsterdam. So here's hoping the Wi-Fi holds out. I'm going to do what I can. I want to make sure we've got enough time for Q&A at the end. So I've got about 35 minutes worth of slides to give you an update on where we are, particularly around our strategic plan, and then look forward to engaging with you all in some discussion. So without further ado, I'll get into today's presentation. In terms of agenda, I just want to give some background in terms of the strategic plan and kind of how we got there, what some of the precedent and underlying foundational work was before we created the latest plan, then go through all the goal areas and outline some things that we've already done, and then highlight where we're going and things that we've got in the hopper, and then also next steps in terms of implementation of the strategic plan. So I'll start by just giving an overview of what preceded the strategic plan. So I will say that the center has had several plans since its inception. We're 14 years old, so that should be no surprise that we've had evolution over time. There was prior strategic priorities that were released by the center in 2014, and those were also updated in 2016. And so some of the items that were noted in those plans are listed on the left-hand side there. And then in 2017, we did release the comprehensive plan for nicotine regulation that I know many in the room are quite familiar with. We never abandoned that plan. There were certain facets of it that were put on hold, particularly when we saw the marked spike in youth e-cigarette use back in 2017, 2018. But ultimately, several of those components continued to move forward and continue to flesh out further and continue in our latest strategic plan. That said, we want to continue to make sure that we're moving forward in a strategic and nimble way. And so we've taken from the old, but also expanded in the new to make sure we're able to evolve and be as nimble as possible with our latest strategic plan. That said, in terms of the impetus for this plan, it was multifold. One was that there was a new center director coming on board. So there were plans to ensure that the new plan was not crafted until the new incumbent arrived. And that said, once I did arrive, it occurred simultaneously to the external evaluation from the Reagan-Udall Foundation. I've said publicly a myriad times that I was highly supportive of this evaluation. I was at the time, and I still am now. I think that was a gift to have external entities come in, look under the hood at a very strategic time to see what we were doing well, but also what we could do better. That said, I welcomed the opportunity to get those recommendations. There was 15 total back in December 2022, and they covered a variety of different aspects of the center, including these 6 bucket areas that are outlined below. In terms of proceeding forward on the strategic plan, which was one of the cross-cutting recommendations from that Reagan-Udall report in that first bucket area that I just showed you on the preceding slide, we wanted to make a comprehensive approach of this, and we also thought it was important to bring in someone that could focus 100% of their energies on this, and that was outside of the center and could help guide us with a fresh set of eyes. That said, we did enlist colleagues from FDA's Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Risk Management, which sits in the Office of Operations, so under the Chief Operations Officer. And so almost immediately after the receipt of the recommendations, we began the foundational work to create a plan around how to execute the development of the strategic plan. So that began in February. After that point, we did have a series of engagements to collect information internally, particularly from staff from across the center. I feel very strongly that a bottom-up approach is key for these types of things, and that's my overall leadership and management style. So I wanted to engage the staff, and that's exactly what we did, to get feedback, particularly that historical context, making sure we engaged with not only staff-level folks, but also leadership across the center. Once we got the internal feedback, feedback, we then shifted to external. You all know my 4 pillars since I took the center director position, and one of those is stakeholder engagement. That's still very important to me, and I wanted to make sure that external folks had that opportunity to engage. We did that in a multitude of different ways, including a Federal Register notice that was issued in July, and we kept that open and for 60 days to ensure adequate input from various individuals who wanted to do so. We also received in total through that just over 2,400 written comments. For those who weren't able or didn't want to do in writing, we also held a 6-hour virtual public listening session as well. We ensured that every single person who wanted to speak got the opportunity to speak. We made the decision to extend the time period to 6 hours based on the number of people who wanted to speak to make sure that we did accommodate everyone. And after that, then we synthesized all the information. And so that took some time. And ultimately, we all along relayed that we intended to finish by the end of the year, and that's exactly what we did. In December of 2023, we ultimately released the new strategic plan. Ultimately, we wanted to take a formative, comprehensive, and objective approach here, and that is exactly what we did. That takes time to do, including putting things to the Federal Register notice and making sure we read all the comments. And so we ultimately took the time to make sure we did this right in a formative way, but also an inclusive way that ensured that we got feedback from all those involved. That said, this is where we landed. After the synthesis of all the information, there's 5 key goal areas. I'm going to walk you through all 5 of those today. The first relates to developing, advancing, and communicating comprehensive and impactful tobacco regulations and guidance. And so this falls largely in our Office of Regulations within the center. Goal 2 is ensuring timely, clear, and consistent product application review. And so this falls largely within the Office of Science at the center. There's some overlap with other offices, including our comms folks. And then also strengthening compliance in regulated industry, utilizing all available tools, including robust enforcement actions. So this largely squares with our Office of Compliance and Enforcement. And then goal area 4 was enhancing knowledge and understanding of the risks associated with tobacco product use. So this is our Office of Health, Communications, and Education. And then finally, advancing operational excellence, which is a bureaucratically technical term for our Office of Management, making sure that we've got the people and resources to fully accomplish our mission and all of the programmatic activities outlined in the preceding 4 goal areas. So ultimately, this was a nice way that also ensured that we had clear ownership of all the goals and key focus areas for the offices to center their effort, even though there's some cross-pollination. But ultimately, the way that it ultimately panned out, there's an office from the center assigned to each of the key goal areas. In addition to the goal areas, we also created cross-cutting themes. So the first was robust science. As I've said myriad times before, we are a data-driven agency. I am a scientist. As a scientist, we're going to continue to keep science front and center in our efforts. Also, health equity is also a key component of those cross-cutting themes as well. That's interwoven across all the work that we do. Transparency, which I think was the key word heard loud and clear from the external evaluation. So we wanted to make sure that was a clear theme throughout this new strategic plan, and then also stakeholder engagement as well. We can't do this alone, and ultimately it's critical that we bring everyone to the table. We may not always agree with all stakeholders at all times, but I'm not sure that happens with much of anything, but that's good. Bringing constructive critique and varying perspectives, I think, is important to ultimately get to a good place in a constructive and collegial way. So these 4 cross-cutting themes are interwoven across all of the components of the strategic plan and will be for the next 5 years. As a part of the strategic plan, we also revised our vision and mission following feedback we received not only from staff, but also external entities. In terms of the major areas where we included additional verbiage was to focus on our public health purview, particularly given the appropriate for protection of public health standard that was prescribed to us by the U.S. Congress, and also to include specifically health equity language, which is increasingly important. Of course, we've seen very meaningful and important declines in combustible tobacco smoking in this country, but we're also mindful that disparities persist. And if we really want to achieve our goals and priorities, it's critical that we do address efforts to broach disparities and to advance health equity. So our new vision and mission are noted here on this slide and also available on our website as well. So now let's dive into the different goal areas. As I noted, we'll start with just giving an overview of the broader objectives within each of them. I'll note that there's also some outcome language as well, but I didn't want to overclutter the slides, so you're welcome to go online and to see the more specifics. And after each of these, I'll just give you a sampling of some of the things in the hopper and also areas where we're headed. So as I noted, the first goal area relates to regulations and guidance. This is work in our Office of Regulations, and the objectives here were to develop and implement a cohesive regulation and guidance agenda, making sure we have that blueprint and plan moving forward, and also importantly, so the public knows where we're headed and what our key priorities are in the short and long term. Also to advance comprehensive and impactful regulations and guidance. Talk is cheap. It's one thing to say you're going to do it, but making sure that we're actually advancing them is another story. Of course, there's complexities in accomplishing that, but as a proud civil servant for nearly a decade and a half, I'm mindful of making sure that we do continue to advance things in a meaningful way when we have the opportunities to do so, and otherwise making sure we still keep them on the back burner until opportunities do arise to accomplish that. And then the final objective is ensuring that tobacco regulations, guidance, and related public statements are clear and accessible. And again, this gets at that cross-cutting theme of transparency to make sure that we're relaying our intent and also giving opportunity for folks externally to contribute in a meaningful way. So what have we done to date? So with the release of the strategic plan, we did release the new policy agenda. This is something we're going to revise on an annual basis. It will largely align with the unified agenda, but it also gives us opportunity to make more frequent tweaks to the document to reflect realities and new timelines as things move forward. And so you can go online and get all of this information. We have divided it in terms of current priorities and long-term priorities. And so here are all of the regulations that are on that list for your viewing pleasure. Several of these, I'm sure, are not a surprise to folks on the current priorities. As I've said publicly many times, the product standards are number 1 and number 2, the final rules around menthol and flavored cigars. And then the nicotine standard is number 3, but we also have several others, including finalizing the T21 rule and also an administrative detention of tobacco products rule on our enforcement and compliance work, and also the requirements for tobacco product manufacturing practices, which we did have a public meeting and related to TPSAC last year. In terms of longer term priorities, there's some others that we're still working on, not as urgent as the others. Of course, we want to make the biggest public health impact as prominently as possible. And you'll notice that the priority product standards are all on combustible products because we know addressing those will have the greatest impact on public health, since it's responsible for the overwhelming burden of death and disease from tobacco use. But in terms of other long-term priorities, we've got investigational tobacco product application rule, nicotine toxicity warnings, establishment, registration, and product listing for tobacco products, and also end safety standards, including those for toxicants and impurities and nicotine, the humectants, and e-liquids, and then also a rule on modified risk tobacco product applications. So these are rules, but of course we also do guidances as well. And so these are the guidance documents that are included on that. And again, this is the next year, and things always change with time. And of course, with varying priorities, if there are shifts in administrations, we evolve accordingly. In terms of the guidances, we've got tobacco product standard for menthol and cigarettes, a small entity compliance guidance that would complement the rule. Same goes for the cigar rule as well. We're also working on a civil money penalty guidance for regulated tobacco entities. I've said this publicly many times, our intent to leverage more prominently our civil money penalty authorities. And so we want to make sure that there's a guidance in place that clearly articulates our intent and the various fees and fines associated with that. And then also finally, a tobacco product tests, methods, validation, and verification and record keeping for analytic methods, final guidance as well. So a lot of items in the queue. Again, things can shift with time, but these are the current priorities, and our commitment is to adjust these accordingly as routinely as possible, but no longer than annually. So in terms of key items in the hopper, as I noted, the product standards remain priority number 1 and 2. They remain a priority. I've said that publicly many times. In terms of the current state of affairs, FDA has moved these to the final stages of rulemaking. They were submitted to the White House Office of Management and Budget in October, and it is now with the White House for determination around timing. I will say that FDA continues to do all it can to keep these a priority. I'll say at present we're still committed to getting these out, and it's a matter of when, not if, that occurs. Of course, we know these would have a profound public health impact, including preventing initiation and also helping to enhance cessation, particularly among populations with disproportionately higher rates of use, including African Americans, the LGBTQIA+ community, and those with behavioral health conditions. So these final rules are the top priorities, and I've said many times that the nicotine product standard, the proposed rule, would follow thereafter. This still remains a priority. I think if we want to do something around harm reduction, this would be arguably one of the most profound population-based strategies we could do to accomplish that. And so, as we've stated, we intend to propose a product standard that would establish a maximum nicotine level to reduce addictiveness of cigarettes and certain other combustible products. This is a proposed rule, so it hasn't yet reached the public comment period, but as we do with all of our rules, the intent would be to open that up for the public to provide a comment on, as we always do, and then inform next steps thereafter, including decisions of whether to proceed forward with a final rule. So those aren't the only things in the hopper, but as I noted, if you look at the policy agenda, you can get a feel for the other things we're working on. But those are the only 3 I'm going to go into detail today for timing purposes. So moving on to goal area 2, ensuring timely, clear, and consistent product application review. 3 major objectives there in terms of identifying and developing and implementing processes that achieve application review efficiencies. We're mindful that we've got a high volume of applications, and we want to do everything we can to identify efficient ways to get through those more expeditiously, but also while doing so, not compromising the integrity of the scientific review. We also want to ensure clear communication and transparency. The T word is there again, making sure we're bringing folks along the way, making them clear about what our expectations are, what our progress is, and ultimately any information that we need from them to get to the finish line. And then importantly, as I've noted, we're a data-driven agency, so that overarching theme of science, we want to use the best available science to inform our decision making. So where are we in terms of pre-market tobacco application review? As folks know, we had 26 million applications. We're 99% through those applications, so we're making good progress. That does include the AAP of covered applications as well, which we are court ordered to report on a quarterly basis. We are now at 94% and on track to get to 100% by Q2 of this year. As we've noted, we intended to get through those as expeditiously as possible, but we need to make sure they're scientifically and legally defensible. And so there's several legal decisions and also submissions of amendments from applicants that we want to make sure that we consider. If we have information sitting before us that could help inform a decision, including more robust science, we want to make sure we consider that in our decision making. All that said, at present, we've authorized 23 e-cigarette products and devices, all of which are tobacco. We've issued negative decisions to millions. That said, there will be more authorizations. And as I've said myriad times in the past, there's no de facto policy against authorization of flavored e-cigarettes. I've been unequivocally clear about what the expectation is on that front, including the importance of demonstrating the benefit to adult smokers, including for flavored products that outweighs the benefit from a tobacco flavored variety. And so that comparison is key. We've been clear about that. I know several folks have heard that loud and clear. We know it's possible to get an authorization, but we need to ensure that folks provide sufficient science to achieve that. And we're committed to continuing to work with applicants to enhance the rigor of the science and make sure that they are best equipped to get those authorizations. Of course, we also have additional applications that came in through the synthetic nicotine pathway once we got authority in April of 2022. I'm pleased to say we're now 100% through the application review. That was another one that was a sizable bolus of applications. On my first day on the job, I did the calculation, and in the time period we were allotted by Congress, we would have had to do 17,000 applications a day. And that would be if we're working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So as I said at the time, we're going to get through them, but we need to make sure it's scientifically defensible. And that's exactly what we've done. There have been negative RTAs or RTFs on about 930,000 that didn't get through acceptance review. Of course, those individuals and entities have the ability to resubmit once they do have the correct and necessary information to proceed forward. In the meantime, we've got about just shy of 10,000 that have reached the threshold for acceptance review, and then we'll proceed forward with further review. So here's some examples of the latest decisions. We've been very busy over the past year, including issuing many decisions, including on menthol flavored products, the first out of the agency. You'll see that there's many marketing denial orders in this queue. That's not to say that there won't be marketing granting orders in the future. But as I've noted, we need to rely on the science that's provided to us, and we'll continue to make those determinations based on the submission of that information. That said, we continue to get through the remaining applications. As I noted, we're on track to get to 100% of AAP imminently. And also we're working very tirelessly to make sure we get to a period where we're through the bolus of applications and we can start reviewing within that 180 statutory deadline prescribed by law. So in terms of the transparency issue, we've had a lot of engagement with the public. We did have a public meeting in October on the pre-market tobacco product application pathway, which was well attended. A lot of really great dialogue, a lot of exchange between the Office of Science and those who attended. And we anticipate that we'll have similar public meetings on other topics in the future. I'd like to see those as a routine part of the center's portfolio. I'm not always on science. I can see it happen for other topics as well. And so more to come there. And we also did have our first TPSAC meeting in more than 3 years. So that was good. And we're committed to having at least one every year. Of course, we want those to be meaningful, but we're also looking at opportunities for broader level topics for discussion by TPSAC beyond just application specific information, again, to make sure we're utilizing that expertise and the intent of that committee. We're also working again on the transparency to issue information that be helpful to applicants in terms of our decision making around applications. So we have restarted the issuance of scientific policy memos, and so these are the reviewer guides and information that are developed to assist the FDA reviewers with the evaluation of applications. So we released the first tranche of these in April and earlier this month, and there was the first 6 were covered chemistry and toxicology. There's going to be several others over time, and we'll continue to release these on a periodic basis. They are posted online, and you're welcome to view those. And ultimately, these provide a good snapshot of our internal thinking on certain aspects of our regulatory science, covering various topics. So more to come on that front, but we've restarted those again. Heard folks loud and clear the importance of that transparency. So now moving on to enforcement and compliance, topic du jour, a lot of attention around this topic. It's certainly an important one and part of our comprehensive approach. And so in terms of the 3 objectives, educational resources and enhancement on content there, I've been very clear that I want to assume admirable intent and make sure that we give everyone in the supply chain the information they need to comply with the law. And so I'll tell you about some of those efforts shortly. We also want to pursue timely and impactful strategies that adapt with the evolving marketplace as well. And we've ramped up efforts on that front within the past year and a half. And then also importantly, collaborating with other federal agencies. And I think there's a profound misperception by the public that the FDA is the only cook in the enforcement and compliance kitchen. That couldn't be further from the truth. There's a myriad entities in the alphabet soup of the federal bureaucracy that have roles there. And so it's important to us that we continue to engage them to make sure that we take as meaningful action as possible. That said, our enforcement scope is multifold. There's the 4 key players here in the supply chain, and we follow a comprehensive approach that addresses all 4 to make sure we have the greatest impact as possible. Of course, there's less folks in the manufacturing lane than going after every single retailer in the United States, so we're mindful too that things more upstream can be more effective at cutting off flow, including imports at the border, than attempting to go after every single retailer in the United States. but ultimately a comprehensive approach is key, and where we continue to be strategic on that front. As I noted, we want to assume admirable intent, so we have enhanced our retailer education resources. We've released new information within the past year since the Reagan-Udall evaluation, and all that information is accessible to the public, including print materials and downloads for retailers in particular. I've also done several meeting engagements and presentations to retailer groups and held myriad listening sessions as well to actively engage these stakeholders. We've also held a series of webinars for retailers as well. Again, with the importance of releasing new information to make sure that we're as clear as possible about what is expected to comply with the law. We also continue to issue content on our website, including articulating for retailers what is needed to comply with the law, including information if they do receive an enforcement or compliance action, and the necessary steps to no longer be in a violative situation. And more recently, we also just released a new searchable tobacco products database, which we enlisted a contractor to develop. We've heard loud and clear that folks wanted a user-friendly, clickable, searchable database where you can input information and find out what products can be legally sold. And so there's this new list includes all those products, including those that are pre-existing tobacco products, but also those that have gone through the necessary pre-market tobacco product applications as well. There's a few minor exceptions of products that don't fall under these, such as there's an administrative stay and other circumstances, but ultimately that's noted elsewhere on our web in the specific scenarios, and we also include the appropriate caveats in a Q&A section on this website, noting the very limited number of circumstances where a product would not be on this list, but otherwise would be legal to sell. So in terms of actions across the space, we've taken many since the inception of our center, including over 1,300 warning letters for online. Manufacturers, we've taken a variety of actions. Within the past year and a half, we've issued the first 7 injunctions in coordination with the Department of Justice, also the first civil money penalties against e-cigarette manufacturers. More of those to come. We continue to increase those numbers, but we've laid the foundation for those, and those will continue. We've also, over the past year and a half, issued the first civil money penalties for unauthorized sales for the maximum amount against our retailers. And so those are at $20,000 at present. And as I've said, we're in the process of working on a guidance that would enhance those even further. We know that these are impactful based on the ones we've already issued, including for underage sales, but also for the 9-10 unauthorized sale violations. And we continue to leverage that civil money penalty route as much as possible. That does not involve engagement with the Department of Justice, and so the FDA does have the ability to proceed forward. But of course, we also have to be mindful of resources and making sure we're leveraging them in the most impactful way possible. So in terms of latest actions among retailers, as I've noted, these are within the past couple months, more than 550 warning letters and more than 100 civil money penalties. We have ramped up these efforts, and we have done a series of blitzes that we began last summer, and this is now a monthly endeavor. So we're going to continue to see civil money penalties, and the goal is to increase those over time once the guidance is issued to solidify the exact structure of that. But as you can see, we started a series of blitzes with warning letters, and for those that did not comply after the 2-week period, we went in and reinvestigated and then issued civil money penalties. Thereafter, we're focusing on the products we know they'll have the greatest impact on public health, and those are youth appealing products. So primarily Elf Bar as well as others based on NYTS data and others. We're going to follow the data to inform the actions here, but right now the bulk of the products we've been focusing on are those Chinese import products, particularly disposable flavored products that are popular among kids. But as I noted, we're also mindful of the rest of the supply chain, so taking actions against manufacturers, importers, and distributors as well. As I noted, first civil money penalties, first injunctions, but we also do action at the border as well. So we do have several firms listed on the import alerts of note. That's if it's correctly declared, but of course, if you're trying to illegally smuggle something in the United States, you're probably not going to correctly declare it. So we do catch some things through this mechanism, and there is a deterrent effect, and we do have the ability to modify those import alerts, which we actively do when brands change, such as with the Elf Bar progeny products. But ultimately, we do know that products are coming in through other means, including misdeclared products at the border, in which case we do have the ability to bring in collaboration efforts with other entities, including Customs and Border Protection. We did have the joint seizure operation last year, which seized $18 million worth of e-cigarettes at Los Angeles Airport. We will continue those types of operations. They're very, very resource intensive. But again, the importance of reinforcing that in terms of those authorities, that rests with the Customs and Border Protection folks. And so we work very closely with them. Same with regard to injunctions and other actions, including seizures. Those go through the Department of Justice. And so we work very closely with them. FDA does not have independent litigation authority. And so we work very closely with DOJ to prioritize the actions we do take and ultimately leverage the collective resources of all of the agencies and departments to best meet our mission. So moving on to comms. So enhancing knowledge and understanding of the risks associated with tobacco product use. There's three very intentional objectives under this goal, and they all focus on the three major populations for which we will continue to do communications around the health risks of tobacco products. And so one is prevention, which has been a primary focus of the center for many years and will continue to be. We also educate those who use tobacco products about the benefits of cessation. So we have several activities on this front. And then importantly, we also have efforts to educate adults who smoke about the relative risks of tobacco products as well. So this three-pronged approach is going to be our guiding light for the next 5 years. And throughout all of these, remember that overarching cross-cutting theme of science. So we want to make sure we use the science to drive the decision-making across all of these and use that data-driven approach. That said, we continue to do that for real cost. We continue to have ads for combustible smoking among kids, but also for e-cigarettes, since we saw the increase. We just released our latest ads on this front. We do work very diligently to ensure that these are tailored and targeted to youth audiences and attempt to mitigate as much spillover as possible. I can only control so much. There are some adults that like to watch very youth appealing things online. So I can't prevent all spillover, but the team works very diligently to do what they can in the digital environment and keep things as tailored as possible. And that's reflected in these latest ads. We also continue to do vaping prevention education resources focused on youth influencers. And that's not social media influencers. That is what you would expect for anyone over the age of 40. And that's parents and teachers and others that engage with youth. And so we've got a lot of resources for those entities, but also for students and youth themselves, and continue to update those with new stats and information over time. We also have a variety of cessation resources as well. Of course, folks know we have the Every Try Counts program. We also work closely with colleagues at NIH, National Cancer Institute, through smokefree.gov to ensure that we are reinforcing cessation resources and working collaboratively to have a complementary yet distinct cadre of resources coming out of the federal government on this issue. And also, more recently, we also continue to advance continuum of risk work that includes some enhanced work, including by myself writing various commentaries. We did one in addiction last year that was focused on the general public more broadly, and then one that was published in Nature Medicine within the past couple weeks that was focused towards healthcare providers, a very high impact journal, and I think reflecting the available science on this issue. There's, of course, information we do know, but there's also some unknowns, but it's important that we leverage these perspective pieces to clearly articulate and be transparent about where the FDA sits on this issue. This is just the beginning. There's going to be other opportunities as well. We did issue a new website on the relative risks of tobacco products as well that coincided with the new commentary that I penned with Menthol and others from South Carolina program. And we also continue to put our money where our mouth is as well, with a notice of funding opportunity around communicating messaging about the continuum of risk. And this was in coordination with our colleagues at NIH. As I noted before, we have to be data driven. And so it's critical that we have the science that reinforces what the message should be, how it should be delivered, when it should be delivered, how it should be delivered, and to whom. And so ultimately there's key information that we want to get from that research, including the impact on intended populations, which is the adult combustible users, and also impact on unintended populations such as youth. And so we're hopeful that that will continue to move forward, and we'll get some important science to help guide next steps in terms of an enhanced messaging on this issue moving forward. So I'll close it out with the strategic plan goal area 5, which is advancing operational excellence. We've got 3 objectives here: supporting and further developing a highly qualified, inclusive, and high-performing workforce. I should hope that everyone can agree with that. Anyone who's ever been a manager, a leader, you want a highly qualified, inclusive, and high-performing workforce to help achieve your mission. And so we also want to ensure the most efficient and effective use of financial resources. We do have limited resources, and we have a comprehensive array of items that we need to fund. And so given that we've been a flatline budget for a half decade, and we have had to make some tough decisions to cut items, and we continue to reallocate resources where we can, but ultimately more resources are going to be needed if we're going to fully optimize the ongoing work to achieve our mission. And of course, we're also continuing advancing operational enhancements, looking where we can do better, and again, optimizing those resources that we do have to the best way possible. So some areas where we made some good advancement is last fall we did get direct hire authority for 2 years, and that basically allows the center to hire key positions more quickly. So for those who have not worked a day in their life in the federal government, there's a lot of bureaucracy that you got to navigate for hiring, which is understandable, but ultimately there's certain ways that you can get efficiencies, and one of those is through direct hiring authority, which allows the center to move more expeditiously. So we did get that authority, which was a big win. That doesn't mean we're going to open the floodgates and get massive amounts of people, but we are actively working to maximize that opportunity over the next 2 years to bring on as many folks as possible. In terms of other efforts that are underway, as I've noted, resources, I think this has been the elephant in the room for some time that we have not publicly acknowledged, but I'm glad that the Reagan-Udall evaluation did acknowledge it. One is extending 21st Century Cures hiring authority to the FDA tobacco program. We are the only center that currently does not have it, and it creates a profound inequity where there are staff doing the same job at other centers with an FDA that are making more money than those in the tobacco program. And so it's no wonder that people are going to hemorrhage out and go to places where they can make more money with less vitriol. And so ultimately closing that glaring loophole would be very important for ensuring we can hire and compete and get the staff we need to effectively review those applications and to do the enforcement and compliance and make sure we're best equipped to succeed. Also modernizing the tobacco user-fee framework to allow for a fair distribution of user fee assessments of all regulated tobacco products. We do not collect any user fees for e-cigarettes, which is another glaring loophole. We're spending about 90% of our enforcement and compliance resources on a product for which we are not collecting any resources. If we did have those resources, we estimate about $100 million per annum, we would be able to do more. And that about 50% of that would be allocated to enforcement and compliance, about 25% to application review, and the rest to resources, and including research and also some comms work. But ultimately, if we want to fully optimize our work, we need more resources, and with that flatline budget, that's become increasingly problematic. But there's a clear pathway to resolve it, and both of these 21st Century Cures and user fees are ultimately something FDA can't do. That would require Congress, but it's good to make sure that we educate folks about the importance of this, including following the Reagan-Udall evaluation. So before I close, I also want to mention staffing. We have had a lot of opportunities to hire new staff within the center within the past year. Folks have left for good reasons. We've had retirements, we've had promotions, which is a good thing. And I do think that having new blood and vision in any program is healthy for the long-term longevity and success of a program. That said, we welcomed now over a year ago, hard to believe, Matthew Farley, Director of the Office of Science. We also had our inaugural Senior Advisor for Health Equity, Dr. Charlene Lefauve, who joined us from NIH. And that was a first of its kind position for a center at FDA, and I'm very proud to be first horse out of the gate on. We also recently announced a new director of our Office of Health Communication and Education, Ann Rancourt, who currently leads the comms shop for NIDA over at NIH, so highly qualified with a lot of experience in campaigns and messaging. And then also Natasha Phelps, who has been named the Associate Director for Policy and Partnerships. This is a new policy unit that was created in response to the Reagan-Udall evaluation. So again, a direct response to that evaluation feedback. And she She and Anne will be starting next month. And we also have 2 outstanding positions. One is Director of Office of Compliance and Enforcement. That announcement should be made within the coming weeks, as will the Director of Office of Management. And so once we've got our full deck, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to put the pedal to the metal. We certainly haven't been timid thus far. We've got solid folks working in acting roles, but I'm looking forward to having a complete and permanent leadership team where we can fully execute the new strategic plan. So in terms of next steps, where we're headed, so the specific activities stemming from all the goals, outcomes, and objectives outlined in the plan are going to be announced as they're implemented over the coming months and years. So I know a lot of folks have asked about, what's next in terms of operationalizing the plan, and we're working very diligently to make that happen. And we're also working in terms of implementing the plan to make sure we utilize data and analytics to track our progress and also to make adjustments as needed. 5 years is a long time, particularly in a dynamic landscape like tobacco products. And so we want to make sure that we're able to be nimble and evolve. And so we certainly will and will communicate to the public if there are any changes to the plan to make sure we're keeping pace with the landscape. And then finally, we'll provide those routine updates to the public on these activities as appropriate, whether it be implementation or any changes to the plan as well. We want to be transparent about what we're doing and when. So with that, this is the contact information. I'm sure you are all well aware of this already, but wanted to reinforce again in our efforts for transparency and engagement. There's a variety of ways to contact us. We're working very diligently to be as responsive as possible, and I'm committed to doing that. And again, once we've got a full cadre of office leadership back in place, we'll be branching out and hopefully continuing to also be in person for a variety of meetings and engagements. So with that, I'm going to close my federal and bureaucratic mouthpiece, and we have, I think, about 15 minutes or so for Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. King. We're going to give our reactor panel, moderator Cliff, a chance to ask a question, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Cliff?
Thanks, Chris. Hi, Brian. It's good to see you. It's Cliff. Can you see me? I think your camera's way in the back.
It's way in the back. I can see an outline.
I'm waving to you way out there. It's been a little while. Thanks for your remarks. This is going to be the only one from me before I think we turn it to the audience, but this is a joint question, or actually a couple of combined questions from our panelists in the reactor session that we'll be having after this. And I want to thank Mike Cummings, whom you know very well, and Don Kenkel as well for their contributions to it. So you talked about your new article in Nature Medicine, in which you and your co-authors state that, if we read it correctly, healthcare providers should consider now recommending the use of e-cigarettes to patients who have been unsuccessful quitting with FDA-approved cessation treatments. And to us, that sounds potentially groundbreaking. An important caveat, if we understand correctly in the article, is that practitioners should only recommend e-cigarettes that have received PMTA authorization, which raises these few connected questions that you can address all together. How does FDA intend to make this recommendation viable, given that currently there are only actually 6 distinct e-cigarette products that have received PMTA authorization, while there are, as we all know very well, and you've been addressing it today, thousands of more, to many people, appealing illicit products, not to mention thousands of conventional cigarette brands that still saturate the marketplace. And the related question is, how will consumers find out easily which products have received PMTA authorization? Will FDA consider requiring adding a label to those products, making it clear to consumers and to the folks who sell them? And then finally, is this approach intended to be applied, in your vision, potentially to other reduced risk products such as nicotine pouches? So thanks, that's it, and we're all looking forward to your insights.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks, Cliff, and I appreciate all the questions. And I will say that the commentary was intended to be innovative and inherently novel. So appreciate that folks have interpreted it that way. That said, I will say we're working within the parameters of the Tobacco Control Act and what they afforded to us. So I didn't write the act, but I'm responsible for implementing it. That said, we've got a clear purview around the pre-market tobacco product application pathway. And that said, there's there's clear parameters that we are required to evaluate the science. And the reason the commentary reinforced the authorized products is because those are the ones that have gone through the pathway where we've rigorously evaluated the science, and we can definitively say after that review that, yeah, these products are lower risk, and yeah, they're actually going to help people transition completely. We do know that's a wide landscape, and there's some products that can't do that for a variety of reasons, whether that be they can't efficiently deliver nicotine as other products or other innovations aren't present. So that said, for our part, we're committed to continuing to review those applications as expeditiously as possible so that number does go up. I'm very hopeful that they will go up. I'll say anecdotally, I've been seeing improvements in the quality of applications, which I think is a good thing. And so folks are getting the message about what's needed. We know it's possible, and there will be more authorizations in the future. And on balance, we're also continuing to work to make sure that we are conducting enforcement and compliance. And so the goal is to get those violative products out of the marketplace, which I think would preclude any type of marking or otherwise notice on those products that have been authorized. We've got publicly lists and fact sheets and other materials saying what's been authorized. But ultimately, it's a comprehensive approach. I'm hopeful that as we get through this bolus and we see increased quality of applications from applicants, now that they're getting the message about what's needed, that we are going to see a different landscape moving forward. So all that said, I'm hopeful. I do see a lot of opportunity in this space, and I do think that to answer your last question, it also applies to other products as well. But of course, it's the same paradigm. So whether you're talking about another smokeless product, you still have to get authorized. You have to go through the appropriate pathway, and of course, we have authorized several other lower risk alternatives, including very low nicotine cigarettes, but also other smokeless products as well, some of which are flavored. And so there will be more authorizations on that front as well. And so I could see this framing apply to that. But I will say that the most recent commentary was really focused on e-cigarettes because that's the area where we're getting the most attention. The online website was framed in a way that was reflective of the broader landscape of products, but there was some specific Q&A in there related to e-cigarettes, but the intent was very much to apply to the broader landscape of lower risk alternatives that have been authorized.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Thank you. This is Greg Wilson with Altria. Dr. King, thanks for joining us. Appreciate your comments. I wanted to dial in specifically to the enforcement topic, and you talked about and showed some of the metrics. I wanted to talk about civil money penalties for just a second. You've shared the data and what you've done there, but as I understand it, for intentional violations, those penalties could be much, much higher, over $300,000 for intentional violations, or for continuing violations, they could go even further to be 1.3 million, and I think that's for a 30-day period, and up to a total of about 14 million. So those are obviously much more significant civil money penalties that could potentially have a greater deterrent effect. So is that in the consideration for you to be looking to accelerate the use of those more significant civil money penalties?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's the intent of that guidance that I mentioned. And so we want to make sure that we've been clear about what the expectations are. And also that would go through public comment. And so everyone, including regulated industry, would have the opportunity to comment on that guidance. But we want to make sure that we've set the foundation for what the expectations are. But ultimately, that is the goal to enhance the volume, particularly for those repeat offenders. And so I would say more to come and buckle up. But the intent is very much to maximize and utilize the full scope of finding ability that has been afforded to us.
Hi, Brian. It's Jessica Zadinak from ARAC. Good to see you. Hey.
Yeah.
So when we've spoken a few times about our behavioral science firm, and when we talk to potential clients, the industry, and they are looking to expend their resources into the science that you have and CTP, or Office of Science, have been very specific about what you're looking for. Sometimes there's hesitation in starting that because of right now the fact that there are no flavored e-cigarettes that have been authorized. And so sometimes it's like doomsday, right? And there's this fight or flight type of environment where they don't want to put that effort in because there has not been authorization. So 2 questions. 1, what would you say to those that are in the room that are hesitant on starting that? And then second, even if it's not e-cigarettes, what would you say when we talk about a behavioral framework when it comes to other potentially reduced harm products such as oral nicotine pouches?
Yeah. So I appreciate the questions. And I'll say, I'll reiterate what I've said before, that there's no de facto policy. And so if you look at the historical precedent, we have authorized flavored lower risk alternative products. So there's certainly a precedent here. And I do think that we've been unequivocally clear on what the expectation is in terms of what you have to show scientifically in terms of that excess benefit, in terms of comparing the flavored product to the tobacco flavored product, which we know has low use appeal. And so ultimately, if an applicant were to demonstrate that, that would be a key avenue to ultimate authorization. I know a lot of folks are working on that. I've seen some studies, including from you and others, that have been presented at meetings, and I think that's really good. And I encourage the innovation. I encourage the continued robust science. We're a data-driven agency, and I can assure you that with Matthew Farley at the helm of our Office of Science is going to continue to be that way. To date, there has been no center director that has overridden a recommendation from the Office of Science, and that has not changed with my tenure. We certainly have scientific discussions and deliberation, but ultimately the decisions from the Office of Science through the comprehensive review of dozens of scientists hold important weight. And so we've been clear about what that standard is, and we really welcome the opportunity for applicants to bring that science to us. And as I said, I feel very hopeful. I've seen the quality of the science improve, and I think that transparency and dialogue has been really useful, particularly with regard to potential flavored products. That said, I will note that I continue to be concerned about youth use of products, particularly e-cigarettes. I do think it's very promising that we've seen declines, but there's also considerations around the type of products and the flavored products. And so making sure that we have important science to assess what the prevalence of use of those different products are, while also looking at the potential net benefit to adult smokers, and importantly, giving FDA all the information and science we need to make that informed decision to see if the scale outweighs each. So you've got my word that we're going to review the science when we get it, but we really need the applicants and folks to step up and make sure they provide the most robust science as possible. And for our part, we're committed to making sure you've got as much clarity as possible to help get there with a successful application.
Okay, Brian, you got 5 minutes left, and we got 3 questions, so let's try to get everybody in.
Oh, is that news for me to be briefer? Roger that.
Joe Williams from Altria. Dr. King, I appreciated the piece with Toll and with Smith last week, acknowledging the continuum of risk and the role that healthcare providers play. Specific to the healthcare providers aspect, other centers within FDA currently communicate directly to healthcare providers via Dear Healthcare Provider letters communicating relative and timely information about human, drug, or biological information. CEDAR uses conversations and Q&A from staff to communicate timely and relevant information. And the Center for Devices and Radiological Health actually posts letters that they send to healthcare providers on the site. What are your thoughts on how CTP can model what other centers are doing to communicate directly to healthcare providers about the continuum of risk and nicotine misperceptions?
Yeah. So appreciate the question. I will say that, foundationally, there's some inherent distinctions between CTP and other centers. And of course, they have a safe and effective and a therapeutic approval lane, which CTP does not. And so in terms of what can be said on framing, particular to audiences that are administering therapeutic treatment, there's a very fine line. And so there's certain things that would more appropriately come from other centers, including CEDAR, in which case, a therapeutic approved product, some type of e-cigarette or other lower risk alternative would be more effective through that route. That said, it is possible for us to do this type of engagement, and we have initiated formative research to assess perspectives and messaging around healthcare providers. So similar to that funding opportunity related to the general public, we do also have some formative work on healthcare providers, and so the intent is to use that data again to have the information inform where we go in terms of what's the message, how to deliver it, and who best to message it to, so we're reaching that target audience of adult smokers. That said, we also have to be very careful that we stay within our regulatory authority and lane, which is a very fine line when you're talking about any type of therapeutic recommendation. But it's a point that's well taken, and we we've got some things in the works, and I'm hopeful there'll be more. This was just the start, but again, it's complex, as is everything we've done, but I'm hopeful there'll be more opportunity there in the future.
Hi, Roxana Weil, McKinney Specialty Labs. A quick question on the second goal, where you have timely review of applications spelled out. Could you be a little more specific in what you mean by timely in terms of review turnaround times?
Yeah, so the end goal is to get within the 180 statutory deadline. Of course, that's difficult when you receive 26 million applications at once and then another million on top of that for synthetic products. But we're getting to the tail end. We've got 1% left, but I remind folks, 1% of 26 million is still several hundred thousand. And it's like pruning a tree, where the ones at the tail end are the more complex ones, the ones with the most robust evidence that takes longer to review. But the goal is ultimately to get within 100-day statutory, and part of that is also identifying efficiencies along the way. And so I think there's some opportunities there for streamlined pathways. We'll continue to engage with the public to get strategies around that front, and we've also already started implementing those, including through the streamlined flavored pathway. We did announce in a press release last week that we've already reviewed tens of thousands of products through that mechanism, again, to make sure that we get decisions back to applicants as quickly as possible. So if they didn't meet the bar and got a negative decision, they can resubmit as expeditiously as possible to get that information we need to keep it moving.
Okay, Brian, and final question to be respectful of your time.
Hi, Dean Sirota, EAS Consulting Group. What is the priority and status of the TPMP final rule?
So continues to be a priority. We did collect all the comments. We got a lot of really good engagement and also the TIPSAC feedback. So we're in the process of synthesizing that information, and I'm hopeful that we'll be proceeding forward towards a final rule soon. I will say that I've got limited staff in my Office of Regulation, and so we were working like gangbusters on menthol and flavored cigars and nicotine, but the TPMP is still there. But I've only got a certain number of bodies and minds. And so it's still a priority. It's on the unified agenda. It's on the policy agenda. So it's still at the top of our list, including current priorities. And we're working towards reviewing those comments and finalizing it. And I'm hopeful that we'll get there sooner rather than later.
Okay. Well, Dr. King, thank you so very much for spending some time with us. We'll get you out right on time. We appreciate it, and we hope that next year we can see you in person and have a very safe trip.
Great. Look forward to it. Thanks all. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Brian.
Bye.